The Peninsula Hotel restaurant hummed with the quiet confidence of people who never looked at prices on menus. Maya Rodriguez pushed through the kitchen's double doors, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, her third week on the job still making her heart race every time she stepped onto that marble floor. The chandeliers overhead cast everything in a golden light that made the silverware gleam like precious artifacts, and the soft murmur of conversation, mixed with the distant clinking of crystal, created a soundtrack of wealth she was still learning to navigate. She'd worked at diners, sports bars, even a truck stop off Interstate 5, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of serving people who wore watches that cost more than her car. Her black uniform was pressed sharp enough to cut paper, her hair pulled back in the severe bun they required, and her feet already aching in the required heels that she'd bought at a discount store because the real ones they recommended cost $300. $300 for shoes she'd destroy in 6 months. The thought still made her dizzy, but the tips made everything worth it. 1 good night could cover her rent, and 2 could start building that savings account she'd been dreaming about since dropping out of community college to help her mother with medical bills. The restaurant manager, Gerald, watched from his podium near the entrance with the intensity of a hawk tracking a field mouse, his eyes missing nothing, his mouth set in a permanent expression of barely concealed disappointment with the world. He'd already written her up once for forgetting to refill a water glass within 30 seconds, and she knew she was one mistake away from being sent back to serving chicken wings to drunk college kids. The kitchen doors swung open behind her, and Carlos, the sous chef who'd taken pity on her that first overwhelming week, caught her eye and gave a subtle nod toward table 12. She glanced over and felt her stomach drop. The corner table, the one with the best view of the city lights beginning to sparkle as dusk settled over downtown Seattle, was being set up with the restaurant's finest china and the wine glasses they kept in a locked cabinet. This wasn't just VIP treatment. This was the kind of setup that meant someone important enough to make Gerald actually smile was about to walk through those doors. Maya had seen it twice before, once for a tech billionaire, whose face she'd recognized from magazine covers, and once for a Hollywood director who'd left a tip that made her believe in miracles. She adjusted her grip on the tray, steadied her breathing, and made her way to the bar to collect the champagne order for table 7, reminding herself that she'd handled worse pressure before, that she could do this, that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. The thought felt hollow but necessary, a mantra she repeated every shift until maybe one day she'd actually believe it. The man arrived at exactly 7:30, and Maya knew immediately he was the one table 12 had been prepared for. He moved through the restaurant like he owned not just the building, but the entire city visible through those floor-to-ceiling windows, his navy suit fitting him with that casual perfection that only came from custom tailoring and multiple fittings. His hair was silver at the temples in that distinguished way that made men look powerful rather than old, and his handshake with Gerald was brief but commanded attention from every staff member in sight. Maya was assigned to the station covering tables 9 through 15, which meant table 12 fell squarely in her territory, and she felt that familiar flutter of nerves mixed with determination as she approached with the wine list. He barely glanced at her when she introduced herself, his attention focused on his phone, and he ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than her monthly rent with the same casual tone someone might use to order a coffee. She brought the bottle, performed the ritual of showing the label and pouring the taste, and he waved her away without even trying it, already deep in conversation with the 3 other executives who'd joined him. Their discussion was all corporate jargon and stock prices, hostile takeovers and market share, the kind of talk that reminded Maya she was invisible to people like this, just part of the scenery like the chairs and tablecloths. She refilled water glasses, brought appetizers, cleared plates, all while Gerald watched from his podium with that expression that suggested he was waiting for her to confirm his worst expectations. The evening progressed smoothly until the main course, until that moment when everything happened too fast and too slow at the same time. The man stood suddenly, his phone pressed to his ear, his face darkening with whatever news was coming through that expensive device. He stepped back from the table without looking, his heel catching on the slight rise where the carpet met the marble, and Maya saw it unfold like a nightmare in slow motion. He stumbled, arms windmilling for balance, and his elbow caught the wine bottle still sitting on the table. The bottle tipped, burgundy red wine arcing through the air toward the pristine white tablecloth, toward his custom suit, toward the portable computer one of his colleagues had open on the table. Maya moved without thinking, her body reacting before her mind could calculate the risks, her hand shooting out to catch the bottle mid-fall, while her other arm wrapped around the man's elbow to steady him. The wine splashed, but she'd redirected the trajectory just enough that it hit her uniform instead of him, the cold liquid soaking through the fabric and making her gasp. The bottle was secure in her grip, not a drop more spilled, and the man had found his balance against her supporting arm. The restaurant went silent, that particular quality of silence that comes when everyone is pretending they didn't just witness something embarrassing happen to someone important. The man stared at her, his face cycling through shock, embarrassment, and then something harder to read. His colleagues froze mid-conversation, and Gerald was already moving toward the table with that expression of horror reserved for catastrophes that might cost him his job. Gerald reached the table within seconds, his face a mask of professional concern covering pure panic, already apologizing before he even knew what needed apologizing for. Maya carefully set the wine bottle back on the table, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, and stepped back to give the executives space to recover their dignity. The man brushed off his suit with sharp, irritated movements, checking his phone screen for damage, while his colleagues straightened papers and closed the laptop that had narrowly avoided destruction. Gerald was in full damage control mode, offering complimentary desserts, suggesting they move to a fresh table, his voice smooth as cream and twice as rich with concern. But the man held up one hand to silence him, his eyes fixed on Maya with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the carpet. She knew that look. It was the look of someone calculating whether to complain, whether to demand she be fired for daring to touch him without permission, whether to make her pay for witnessing his moment of human clumsiness. She'd seen variations of it before, in customers who treated service workers like props that occasionally malfunctioned. She straightened her spine, met his gaze, and waited for the axe to fall. Instead, he surprised her. His expression softened slightly, and he gave her a small nod that might have been approval or might have been dismissal. She couldn't tell which. Then he turned back to Gerald and said something in a low voice that she couldn't quite hear over the resumed conversation of nearby tables. Gerald's face transformed from panic to relief to something like confusion, and he nodded vigorously, backing away with that peculiar walk of someone trying to appear calm while moving as fast as possible. Maya stood there dripping wine onto the expensive carpet, unsure if she should leave or stay or apologize or vanish into thin air. Another server, Jennifer, appeared at her elbow with a practiced smile and smoothly took over the table, suggesting to Maya that she might want to get cleaned up. The walk back to the employee area felt like miles, past tables of diners who'd already forgotten the incident, past Gerald who wouldn't meet her eyes, past the kitchen where Carlos gave her a sympathetic grimace. In the tiny bathroom that staff shared, Maya stared at her reflection and tried to assess the damage. The wine had soaked through her uniform from shoulder to hip, staining the black fabric an even darker shade, and her white undershirt was completely ruined. She smelled like a vineyard, and her carefully styled hair had come partially loose from its bun. She looked like exactly what she was, a waitress who just made a scene in front of the most important table in the restaurant. She grabbed paper towels and did what she could, knowing it was pointless, knowing the uniform was destroyed, knowing she'd have to buy a replacement she couldn't afford. When she emerged, Gerald was waiting in the hallway with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something almost like respect, mixed with confusion, like he'd just discovered his furniture could talk. Gerald led her to his cramped office tucked behind the kitchen, a space barely large enough for his desk and the filing cabinets stuffed with schedules and inventory lists. He closed the door, which immediately made Maya's anxiety spike because nothing good ever came from closed-door conversations with managers. She prepared herself for the lecture about boundaries, about not touching customers, about how her instinct to help had probably just cost them their most valuable client. But Gerald just stood there for a long moment, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Finally, he held out a business card, plain, white, with raised black lettering. She took it carefully, trying not to drip wine on it, and read the name embossed across the center: Richard Chen, Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Hospitality Group. The name rang a distant bell, something she'd maybe heard on the news or seen in a headline she'd scrolled past. Gerald must have seen the confusion on her face because he let out a long breath and sat down heavily in his desk chair. He explained what she should have already known, what everyone else on staff apparently understood without being told. Meridian Hospitality Group owned this hotel, owned 37 other properties across North America, owned restaurant chains and catering companies, and half the high-end food service industry on the West Coast. Richard Chen wasn't just some VIP they rolled out the good china for. He was, functionally speaking, everyone's boss several layers up the corporate ladder, and she'd just grabbed him to keep him from falling on his face in front of his own executives. Gerald seemed torn between admiration and terror, like he couldn't decide if Maya had just saved them all or doomed them completely. He told her to go home, change, take the rest of the night off. The way he said it made it sound less like kindness and more like he needed her out of sight while he figured out what kind of damage control might be necessary. She asked if she still had a job, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be, and he paused long enough that her heart sank. Then he said something that made even less sense than everything else that had happened that evening. He said Mr. Chen had specifically requested that she not be disciplined, that he'd even suggested she deserved recognition for quick thinking and professional conduct. Gerald said it like he was reading from a script written in a foreign language, like the words made no logical sense but he was obligated to recite them anyway. Maya went home to her studio apartment that smelled like the Thai restaurant downstairs, peeled off her ruined uniform, and tried to process what had happened. She'd expected to be fired. Instead, she'd apparently impressed someone so far above her pay grade that they existed in an entirely different atmosphere. It felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life for a moment, and now had to figure out how to step back out. She threw the uniform in the trash, knowing the wine would never come out, and tried to calculate how many shifts she'd have to work to replace it. Then she looked at the business card Gerald had given her, sitting on her tiny kitchen counter next to bills she couldn't quite afford to pay. The cardstock was heavy and expensive, the kind of thing meant to convey importance. She wasn't sure why Gerald had given it to her, she wasn't sure what any of it meant. 3 days passed. 3 shifts where Maya worked her other tables while Jennifer covered 12. 3 days of Gerald treating her with cautious politeness instead of his usual critical oversight. The other servers noticed, asking her what had happened, what strings she'd pulled, but she had no answers to give them. She'd done her job, had a moment of decent reflexes, and somehow landed in some weird limbo where management didn't know quite what to make of her. Then on Thursday morning her phone rang, with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another spam call about her car's extended warranty, but something made her pick up. The voice on the other end was professional, female, official. She introduced herself as Claire Nakamura from Meridian Hospitality Group's Human Resources Department, and Maya felt her stomach drop through the floor. This was it. This was the real consequence, delivered from corporate 3 days late, because that's how long it took for the paperwork to process. They were firing her, not directly, but through proper HR channels, and they'd probably make her sign something agreeing never to talk about the incident. But Claire wasn't calling to fire her. Claire was calling to offer her a position, not at the Peninsula restaurant where she'd worked for 3 weeks, but at Meridian headquarters downtown as a personal assistant to Mr. Chen himself. The salary she quoted was more than Maya made in 6 months of waitressing, with benefits that included health insurance and a retirement plan and things that Maya had stopped thinking of as accessible to people like her. Maya sat on the edge of her unmade bed, still in her pajamas, trying to form words while her brain struggled to process what she was hearing. She asked if this was a joke, if someone was pranking her, and Claire's voice remained steady and professional as she assured her it was legitimate. Miss Chen had been impressed by her quick thinking and discretion, and he needed someone on his executive team who could anticipate problems before they became disasters. The position would start in 2 weeks, giving Maya time to give notice at the restaurant and make arrangements. Claire said it all like it was perfectly normal, like waitresses got offered executive assistant positions every day, like Maya's entire life hadn't just been picked up and shaken like a snow globe. Maya heard herself accepting, heard words coming out of her mouth about being honored and grateful and excited, all the things you're supposed to say when someone offers you a miracle, but inside her mind was racing through 1,000 questions. Why? What had she really done that was so impressive? Was this real, or was she about to show up to some office and discover it was all a misunderstanding? She thanked Claire, ended the call and sat in her apartment for a long moment, the morning light streaming through her single window, dust motes dancing in the air. Then she called her mother, who cried and asked if Maya was sure it wasn't a scam. She called her best friend Zara, who screamed so loud Maya had to hold the phone away from her ear. She sat with the knowledge that her life had just changed direction so sharply she had whiplash, and tried to figure out what it meant. That evening, she gave her notice to Gerald, who accepted it with an expression mixing relief and something like regret. Meridian headquarters occupied floors 20 through 35 of a glass tower in downtown Seattle's financial district, the kind of building that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought architecture should inspire both awe and mild intimidation. Maya stood in the lobby on her first day, wearing a suit she'd bought on credit at Nordstrom Rack, because she literally owned nothing appropriate for an office environment, and tried to look like she belonged there. The security guard checked her name against a list, issued her a temporary badge, and directed her to the 29th floor with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The elevator was glass on one side, offering a view of the city dropping away as she ascended, and Maya focused on breathing steadily because this was really happening. This was real, and she couldn't afford to panic now. The 29th floor was all glass walls and sleek furniture, modern art that probably cost more than her entire education, and people moving with that purposeful stride of individuals who knew exactly where they belonged in the corporate ecosystem. Claire from HR met her at reception, looking exactly like she'd sounded on the phone, polished and professional with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She walked Maya through the basics, the layout of the floor, where the bathrooms were, how the coffee system worked, all while Maya tried to memorize every detail and not think about how everyone they passed looked at her with casual curiosity. Claire stopped at a desk positioned just outside a corner office with windows facing both the sound and the city, explained that this was Maya's workspace, and that Mr. Chen would meet with her at 9 to discuss expectations. Then she was gone, and Maya was alone with a computer she didn't know how to log into, a phone system that looked like it required an engineering degree, and 30 minutes until her boss arrived. She spent those minutes exploring her desk drawers, which were empty except for basic supplies, and trying to calm the voice in her head screaming that she was a fraud, that she had no business being here, that someone would figure out she'd only ever worked service jobs and never finished college. At exactly 9 o'clock, Richard Chen emerged from the elevator and walked toward his office with that same confidence she remembered from the restaurant. He paused at her desk, and she stood quickly, almost knocking over the coffee she'd nervously poured herself. Up close in the morning light, he looked tired, the kind of tired that came from too many time zones and not enough sleep, but his eyes were sharp when they focused on her, assessing and analytical. He asked if she'd gotten settled in, and she said yes, even though it was a lie. He nodded, gestured for her to follow him into his office, and closed the door behind them. The office was surprisingly modest for someone at his level, functional rather than ostentatious, with actual work papers stacked on the desk rather than just for show. He sat, indicated she should sit across from him, and studied her for a long moment before speaking. Richard Chen didn't ease into the conversation with small talk or corporate pleasantries. He asked her directly if she understood why she was really there, and Maya decided honesty was her only option, since lying to a CEO seemed like a spectacularly bad career move. She told him she assumed he was impressed by her reflexes at the restaurant, but that she honestly didn't understand why that warranted this kind of promotion. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. Not the professional smile he'd worn at the restaurant, but something more genuine, almost rueful. He explained that he hadn't built a hospitality empire by ignoring useful information, and what she'd done at that table had told him several important things about her character. First, she'd reacted instinctively to prevent harm, even though it meant personal cost to herself, a ruined uniform. Second, she'd done it without hesitation or calculation of what she might gain. Third, and perhaps most importantly, she'd been discreet afterward, hadn't tried to leverage the moment, hadn't told other staff members about his stumble, hadn't posted about it online for attention. He said that kind of discretion was rare, that most people would have found some way to capitalize on witnessing a powerful person's embarrassing moment. He'd checked afterward, had one of his team monitor social media and talk to the restaurant staff, and her name never came up in any gossip or stories. She'd simply done what needed doing and moved on, and that quality was worth more than any resume or college degree. Maya felt something shift in her chest, a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying suddenly becoming lighter. She asked him if this was a test, if he was setting her up to fail somehow, and he looked at her with something like understanding. He told her that he'd grown up in his family's restaurant in Sacramento, washing dishes at 8 years old, working the line at 12, managing night shifts by 16. He knew what it meant to work service industry jobs, knew the particular exhaustion and humiliation that came from serving people who treated you as less than human. He'd built his company from 2 small hotels his parents owned into the empire it was now, and he'd never forgotten where he started. He said he looked for people who understood hard work, who had empathy, who could think on their feet, and she demonstrated all 3 in about 5 seconds at that restaurant. This position wasn't charity, it was strategic. He needed someone who could anticipate problems, who understood people, who wasn't so immersed in corporate culture that they'd forgotten what real service meant. He needed someone who would tell him the truth instead of what he wanted to hear. He asked if she could do that, if she could handle the pressure of working directly for him, and Maya felt herself nodding before she'd fully processed the question. She told him she'd never had a job she couldn't figure out eventually, and if he was willing to give her a chance, she'd prove he'd made the right choice. He stood, extended his hand, and they shook on it like partners instead of boss and employee. As she left his office and returned to her desk, Maya realized this wasn't about the wine bottle at all. It was about someone seeing potential in her that she'd barely begun to see in herself. The first month passed in a blur of learning curves so steep they were practically vertical. Maya discovered that being a personal assistant to a CEO meant juggling schedules across multiple time zones, understanding corporate politics she'd never encountered, and making decisions that affected budgets larger than anything she'd ever imagined. She made mistakes, several of them, including double booking Richard for a meeting with the board and a conference call with Tokyo investors, which resulted in a controlled chaos that took 3 hours to untangle. But Richard didn't fire her for those mistakes. He sat her down, explained what she'd missed, and showed her the systems he used to prevent exactly that kind of collision. He was demanding, but not cruel, expected excellence but understood she was learning, and gradually Maya began to feel less like an imposter and more like someone who actually belonged in that glass tower. She learned to read his moods, to know when he needed coffee before he asked, to anticipate which calls would go long, and build buffer time into his schedule. She learned corporate speak, that peculiar language where nothing was ever a problem but rather a challenge or opportunity. She learned office politics, who had real power versus who just had titles, and how to navigate requests from executives who thought their projects should always take priority. She built relationships with Richard's department heads, learned their communication styles, figured out who needed detailed briefings and who preferred bullet points. Her mother still called every few days, amazed that her daughter worked in a downtown office tower, and Maya would stand at her apartment window looking at the city lights and feel a strange disconnect between who she'd been 3 months ago and who she was becoming. She kept in touch with Carlos from the restaurant, who'd been promoted to head chef, and with Zara, who made her promise not to forget her roots now that she was corporate. But Maya hadn't forgotten. If anything, those years of service work informed everything she did now, gave her patience with difficult people, taught her to stay calm under pressure, reminded her that everyone deserved basic respect regardless of their position. Richard noticed, commented on it during one of their morning briefings, said that her perspective was exactly what his executive team needed more of. 6 weeks in, he invited her to sit in on a strategic planning meeting, not to take notes but to contribute ideas. She spoke up once, suggesting they focus more on employee satisfaction in their hotels, because happy staff created better guest experiences, and the room went quiet in that particular way that meant people were actually considering what she'd said instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. Afterward, Richard asked her to develop that idea into a full proposal, said he wanted her thinking about the company strategically, not just managing his calendar. Maya stayed late that night working on the proposal, looking out at the city lights, spread below her like a constellation of possibilities. She thought about that night at the restaurant, about the wine bottle, and the stumble, and the split-second decision that had changed everything. She thought about how close she'd come to just letting him fall, to protecting herself instead of helping, and what she would have missed if she'd chosen differently. The truth was, she hadn't shielded Richard Chen from humiliation because she expected anything in return. She'd done it because it was the right thing to do in that moment, because service meant actually serving, because she'd been raised to help people when they needed it. The promotion, the opportunity, the new life unfolding in front of her, those were consequences she couldn't have predicted. But sitting there in that office, working on a proposal that might actually improve thousands of workers' lives, she realized that maybe the real lesson wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was about showing up, doing your best, treating people with dignity, and trusting that eventually someone would notice. Maybe it was about understanding that we're all just one stumble away from needing someone to catch us, and that being the person who reaches out instead of looking away was its own kind of power. Maya saved her work, shut down her computer, and headed home through streets that felt less intimidating now that she walked them every day. Tomorrow she'd present her proposal. Tomorrow she'd learn something new. Tomorrow she'd continue becoming whoever she was meant to be. But tonight, she was just grateful for wine stains and second chances, for the mysterious ways life could pivot on small moments, and for finally, believing she deserved to be in that room.